Hello everyone, a while back somebody in the comments had asked me about my kOS launch script for Kerbal Space Program, and I'm here to explain it, how to modify it for different rockets, and then you can use it as well. It'll be in the video description. This is the baseline launch script. I've explained it before in a video. After all, this was actually written up in 2019, so it's a 7-year-old thing. And probably it needs to be tweaked and improved upon somewhat because it doesn't really hit those apoapsis and periapsis numbers. And well, I mean, if your apoapsis is really high, like you're trying to go to geostationary orbit or something, it should do that. But otherwise, it's not very good at being accurate the way ascent guidance from MechJeb is. However, it is much more flexible than MechJeb is. So I'll explain why. First of all, we have the turning off of SAS because kOS requires that. I'm just gonna modify it right now with something right away because there is one new thing that needs to happen, and that is to dampen the roll. So I'm gonna add the roll dampening that I usually add these days. So that's right up there. That's what that does. And then you set your numbers. If it's a high apoapsis, that will have an effect. And then your inclination, it should get to that, unless you put some really bad inclination. Then the first thrust-weight ratio is the thrust-weight ratio at sea level on liftoff. And then the second thrust-weight ratio, one thing you don't have to do with this launch script is tweak the launch curve too much, unless you don't think that it's getting the ideal results. Then you tweak this steepness number, and it generally ranges from 0.4 to 1.4. There's a mathematical reason for that. If you pick numbers outside of that, it's going to potentially cause some math problems. Now, this is the second stage vacuum start thrust weight ratio, or the average of the second and third stage, depending on your setup. And then there's the ending thrust weight ratio when you reach orbit. So it uses those in various calculations. Then there's the start roll on the launch pad. This is the number on your nav ball that is at your left wing. So this little nav ball has a little symbol, and there's a left wing to it. It's on the left. So it's the number on the left of the nav ball. So that heading is the one that is the start roll. And then steepness, I have it at 0.8, but you can change it depending on how steep you need the trajectory. But again, it should generally work because of the calculations involved. Unlike ascent guidance, you don't have to change the things each time. And then it does some initial calculations. And the way this is structured is very different from the way ascent guidance or any normal launch script is structured. And that's because I didn't know how to structure that that way back when I wrote it. And I structured it the way I do things. So it's cut up into little modes, and each mode represents, this is one thing that I do, and then there's the next thing that I do, and then there's the next thing I do. And so the logic of it is mimicking what I do when I launch rockets. And so it tells it to point in a particular place. This is going to be straight up. And then lock the throttle to 1, so throttle up. Stage, so that should ignite the engines. Wait some time for the engines to spool up. You might have to increase that depending on your engines. And then if the ship max thrust, and then if the ship max thrust is greater than the ship mass, stage again, that should be the launch clamps. And then set that as the ignition time, just in case you were wobbling at the start, because if you're wobbling at the start, it might start the in-game clock early. And so this is all to set the time properly for the script so that it knows when to stage things. And that's if you're doing timed stages. And then wait 2 seconds after the launch clamps release, and then change the mode. If the ship max thrust is too low, that means the thrust weight ratio is less than 1, then print stage under thrust. Now, this requirement that it'll only stage the launch clamps when the thrust weight ratio is greater than 1, or if the thrust weight ratio is greater than 1, can cause problems if you have boosters that stage at the same time as the clamps, like with the space shuttle, or if you're attached to some heavy pad, like Pekka's Starship Super Heavy. So in those cases, I generally add times 0.01. The reason why the condition is here to check the thrust is because of test flight. If you're using test flight or something else that causes engine failures, especially on launch, then this prevents launch so that you don't lose your rocket, right? So yeah, that's that condition. But you can add this to it if you don't want that to happen. So just keep that in mind. And then this is the amount of time. Mode 2 is when it's going straight up but isn't starting its turn yet. There's before the pitch program. And so we have that, and then we have the pitch program. So the pitch program is managed by this equation, and I'll talk more about how you get such an equation in a different video. So what we have here is a condition to stage, and that staging is based on the thrust. If the thrust is less than 1 kilonewton, it will stage, and then it is going to, if that number is 1 instead of 0, go to the next mode. As long as it's 0, it won't change mode. So there's that condition for staging, and there's also a time stage. So if we go down to the bottom of the script, we have the thrust stage option. So there's a thrust limit. So you can set it to some other number. Let's say you've got boosters, and the boosters provide 6,000 kilonewtons and your core provides 2,000. So then to figure out how to stage, you will actually put in here the thrust limit. If it's less than, say, 3,000, then stage. Then it'll stage off the boosters. And in that case, because you don't want it to keep staging, you would want it to switch mode. So that's when you use if next mode is equal to 1, set mode to mode plus 1. So then it'll change the mode to the next one. You might not want to do that too early. In that case, it's better to use a timed stage. So if you don't want to move on to the next mode, probably the thrust stage option is not what you want. Use a time stage and use this system where you set the time. Remember, we set the clock earlier. And then you've got a stage count so that it increments, so that it doesn't do it repeatedly. Now, what else you can do is, instead of just using one of these functions, you can just copy this block from here and write in the thrust that you want, put this in the appropriate location in the script, and just get rid of this bit. So you'll just copy this, get rid of this bit, and then it'll stage when the thrust is low. And you should create an incrementer so it doesn't do it repeatedly. So what I mean by an incrementer is you say set increment to 0 here, okay? And then when you add the thrust condition here, if increment is equal to 0 and that, then stage, and then if increment is equal to 0, set increment to 1. Then it won't do it again. So that's the format for if you want to, ignoring the parameter part, this bit. That's the format if you want it to stage things when the thrust is below a certain amount because of the boosters, and you want to make sure it doesn't keep staging. That's the format. So you'll have to create that variable at the start. I use the global variable format, and that's generally frowned upon, but it works. And people generally like to keep the variables local. I don't care. So yeah. This here is to limit it if it has too high a time to apoapsis, and here it's saying that if the time to apoapsis is more than 2 minutes, it's going to try and pitch down a bit. And maybe I should add another variable or another condition for how much it should pitch down by, but it just calculates it by this, and right now it just pitches down by 4 degrees, and that's just it. So that's the limit. I could probably have a variable limit instead. Okay, so that is all sort of based on the pitch program. Mode 3 is the pitch program there. Then it'll end up at some pitch that was based on the calculation based on the thrust weight ratios that you entered. And then we go to mode 4. Once it's pretty high up, stage the fairings. This is where it stages the fairings. And then here, it's going to start trying to calculate where it is actually compared to orbit. So it figures out its velocity, where it is in height, that's this bit. So height versus velocity compares the stuff to determine its pitch. And then, depending on what situation it hits first, it can either go to mode 5 or mode 6. And what determines that is down in the functions again. So this is the condition to go to mode 5, and this is the condition to go to mode 6. And so then mode 5 and mode 6, basically mode 5 tries to manage the vertical speed in one way, whereas mode 6 tries to manage it in a much tighter way. So mode 6 tries to keep it within -20 to 20 meters per second. So there it's pretty close to orbit already. It feels like it's very close to orbit, so it's just trying to keep the vertical speed flat. And then mode 5 is a little bit more dynamic. It's still trying to calculate its time to apoapsis and where it is in height, and managing it based on a wider range of possible pitches. And eventually mode 5 will go into mode 6 as well. And then mode 8 is basically trying to figure out when it's time to stop. Still has a condition for if it needs to stage because of thrust, but here it actually stops when the ship apoapsis is greater than the target apoapsis times a little bit. So it actually overshoots a little bit. That's an old thing because of the low physics tick in Kerbal Space Program, so I might undo that. And here I'm just taking any ship periapsis above 160. So if you wonder why it's not hitting the ship periapsis and always ends up at 160 kilometers, that's why. So you can undo that. You can try and say target periapsis times 0.99, as long as it's greater than that, right? Or you can just leave it be. So that's up to you. And then you should change this one as well. That's in mode 6. In fact, I don't think there is a condition right now to send it to mode 8. So I think this is the one in mode 6 is the one that normally happens. Mode 8 is if you have a close to apoapsis situation, and sometimes you'd need to add a mode 7 for that. So I think that's mode 8 is a vestige of the close to apoapsis circumstance. So then at a certain, you'd probably have a timed thing in mode 6 where it shuts down. Mode 7 is the close to apoapsis, and then mode 8 is the one that will finish it off. So you'll have it change to mode 8 once it's close to apoapsis, does the circularization at apoapsis, and then detects it and then stops. Mode 9 is just stopping. So it locks throttle to 0, gives you back to steering, prints launch program concluded, set mode to 0, which stops everything. And then there's the data being printed out to the screen, to the little kOS console. And that's that. So the rest is calculations for figuring out how it does things, including the dynamic pressure one. And so it'll try to keep close to prograde when the dynamic pressure is high. That's automatic. And there are a few other things that it does automatically, and of course inclination, but it doesn't have as many features as ascent guidance. Ascent guidance is obviously a much more complicated program. This is a very simple thing, but the good thing about it is you can tweak it a lot. And you can figure out what's going wrong because the modes are very clear, and they're fairly short, and they're operating in a very discrete portion of launch. So it'll tell you what mode you're in because that's printed to the screen. And so if something is going wrong in that mode, you can just look at that chunk and see what you need to fix about that. So that's the benefit of this format. And I basically modify it for everything. And again, I'm not personally, for my purposes, because I use this for cinematics. And I really don't care. As long as it gets to orbit, I can usually manage it from there. So it's very important to get the right inclination. It's not so important for me for the apoapsis and periapsis as long as it's in space. Yeah. And then this is the fairing altitude that you want to have the fairing stage at. You can set 0 if you don't want it to do the fairings. Then it'll just change to the next mode without staging the fairings. Keep in mind that it automatically fires action group 1 when it goes to mode 4. That's sort of for a launch escape system or the fairings. Anyway, so there you have it. I'll link it in the video description. Hopefully that's a good enough explanation for how to modify it. I'll go into more detail about the sort of mathematics of things in some other video. So with that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.